Hello, television viewer. Welcome. This is Central Washington University's Geology Talk Show. The title, Central Rocks. I'm your host, Nick Zentner, taped right here in Bullion Hall on the campus of Central Washington University. I appreciate you joining us today. We have a very special guest. He's not in Ellensburg much anymore, but there's a special Bob Bentley sighting, and we snared him and brought him right into the TV studio. Dr. Robert Bentley, it's so good to have you with us.
Thank you, Nick.
Let me tell you quickly about Bob. Eastern Oregon native, went to Oregon State University, bachelor's and master's degrees in geology in the 1950s, and then on to a PhD in geology from Columbia University in New York City in 1966. Suddenly finds himself in Central Washington, of all places, for a long teaching career and research career. Bob, where should we begin? I don't really know.
I don't know either, Nick.
Let's give it a try.
Maybe I could just talk all the time and you wouldn't have to talk at all.
Hey, that would be a nice switch. You could draw a cross-section for us. And
I have been known to do that.
Well, maybe we can start here. What are you doing currently? Where are you living most of the year?
Oh, I live down in Southern Mojave, California, in a little town of Todos Santos. I run a little hotel down there, and I'm studying the local geology down there also, Nick. Yeah.
So you have guests. How many guests typically per night in your
little... 3 to 6 or 7 or something of that order, yeah.
And you've been known to force a little geology on these innocent people?
Whenever I can, I talk about the opening of the Sea of Cortez and things like that, and I probably bore a few of them a little bit to death, but I think it's good for them.
I'm sure it's good for them. They might have their little frozen smiles on, nodding. And yes,
but they come back and they like that.
I'll bet you they do. We had the good fortune to visit this spring with my family, and it was wonderful to see you down there in your element.
And I probably told you some of the same thing. I don't remember exactly, but
the standard Bentley tour. I think we got it.
I don't think there's a standard one there.
And yet you're up here in Ellensburg for a couple of weeks.
That's right.
Is this family? Is this professional? What's up?
This is trying to get back in the string of things before I forget it all. That's the closest to the truth I think I can tell you. And you're talking geologically, so you're still working on some problems here. Yes, I am. And the rocks haven't changed, but the interpretations have changed. So. Well, let's dive right in then. What the heck? Much of your teaching career here at Central, which started in the early 70s and continued for 30 plus years, was devoted to lots of local mapping. Right. What was your main emphasis with your work over your 30-year career? Oh, it's probably the stratigraphy and the structure. We're here on the Olympic Wallowa line, or it's a structural zone that this is probably the main reason we were studying it, but we had to learn the basalt stratigraphy. And so I have, along with Jack Powell and other students, I always got students involved in this. And we learned the stratigraphy sort of from the beginning, and we're still revising that stratigraphy a little bit. That's what we were doing the last 8 days or so. So this is primarily Columbia River basalt stratigraphy. Basalt stratigraphy, but we dabbled, in the younger stratigraphy and not much in the older rocks. But in the younger, the rocks that are on the top of the Columbia River basalts and the rocks in the Kittitas Valley have always fascinated me, and we are and never have published much of this. So I listened to your lecture, I think, on the Kittitas Valley, and it was excellent. Bob, thank you for saying that. Well, you're very welcome, Nick. I learned from the master, that's for sure. Maybe you can give the viewers a sense of how you acquired all this knowledge. Were you just teaching during the academic year and then summers, or were you somehow getting fieldwork into the academic year? All of the above. I got the students involved so that in a lab, we wouldn't spend much time on campus. We would go out because they were right at our doorstep. We maybe started with Craig's Hill a little bit, but we soon got into the Yakima Canyon. We soon got down to the area down by Vantage, and then we had the problem of correlating the basalt stratigraphy between Vantage and the Yakima River Canyon, and we ended up carrying this all the way to the Oregon, all beyond, down to Maupin and up the Deschutes and
Sure.
up the John Day. So I ended up doing essentially a north-south cross-section across from Wenatchee to Maupin. And then we were adjacent to the Hanford studies, so we carried the stratigraphy from the Hanford area to the Cascades. And so we covered a large area and even got down into Oregon and got to the Oregon coast where these basalts dump into the same basalt flow, one of the ones here locally.
Yeah.
Kelly Hollow is at Cannon Beach, so giving you some idea of their extent.
Sure. So this is, at least when I showed up in the early 90s, there were a few weeks there in September that you'd be kind of constantly on the move, right? You would have each fall a different group.
Fall I would start out actually just before the rodeo, and we would be working down in the canyon, learning the basic principles of mapping, and I would run a pretty stiff course. We would start at 7 in the morning, and I would end about 7 at night, and then Jack would take over. And for about 6 to 8 days, something like this, the students were in boot camp.
Yes, they were.
And it was popular with the ones that did well and not so popular with the ones that didn't do it.
Imagine that, imagine that. And then, especially those that did well, but maybe even the ones that hated it, that was the September experience, and then you would take most of those guys down to Southern California.
And then we would go, I would lecture on the structure and the stratigraphy here, but we'd start talking about the stratigraphy and structure down in the Blythe area. And this is southeastern California. And we would take them down the moment we could get people through their final exam. We would take them for a month in essentially the Southern Mojave. And that was completely different, but they just grew tremendously.
Oh, you bet.
Because the rocks down there were technicolor. It wasn't just boring old basalts. It was many other rocks, really of the Grand Canyon series.
So this is 30 years of doing this with students, and you're constantly revising ideas. You are, deciding what you want to map the next September, that sort of thing. Can you give us a feeling for your growth with your understanding of the local geology? Did you have some early ideas that were completely abandoned 30 years later?
What we picked up on what Hoover Mackin had mapped in really the building of the dams at Priest Rapids and Wanapum and really on down to the Dalles. He had found that these same basalt flows were present, and he had published on it, and we just picked up that stratigraphy, and it was good stratigraphy, and we carried it through, and we're still using many of those names, and,
Sure.
and those units are just much more extensive, but he realized how extensive they were. It was just an enormous pile of basalts, and they originate in the foot of the Rockies and flowed to the Pacific. And here we are sort of in the middle of them. Right. And now some of the controversies that now exist is how fast did these lavas spread out? Did they spread out slowly, coming out in a few days or weeks? Rapidly, coming out in a few days or weeks, or did they take 10 years or more? And I don't think we still know the answer. Maybe someplace in between those two.
Let's back up for a sec. So you get your PhD on the East Coast. What kind of work were you doing for your doctoral?
Well, I actually worked in the Archean of the Beartooth, just north of Yellowstone.
Okay.
We were working in 3 billion-year-old rocks, and then I got interested in the Appalachians, which were 400 to essentially 400 million years old.
So this is the late 60s?
This is the late 50s.
Late 50s, okay.
I'm actually older than you think I am.
Oh, well, yes. And I guess what I'm leading to is none of this is really preparation for your work at Central.
Well, I had at Oregon State, I had worked in the Columbia River basalts in Oregon.
Oh, you had?
So I had an understanding and a love of the basalts, and I just, once I got here, wherever I've gone, I learned the local stratigraphy. I just start going out and looking at them, usually getting some students to go with me because they learn in this. And sometimes we just spend every moment that we can. I think my wife sometimes didn't appreciate this quite as much as the students did. So.
Well, yeah, your impact is legendary. The stories continue to this day, and of course it's time in the field. And a lot of departments maybe don't have that figured out, but if you can arrange your program where you've got maximum time in the field with direct supervision, shall we call it, or collaboration with your students, that's the way to go. And
if you can get the students interested or fascinated with your discovering things, you're not out there just telling them. You're out there trying to discover what what the rocks are all about, what their compositions are, what the structures are. This is what it's all about. And then as we get a few age dates, we begin to put the pictures together, and then we rip that apart and we put it back together again. That's the process I've used over the years.
By the way, how did Ellensburg get on your radar screen? How did this even happen for you to be at Central Washington University?
I don't know exactly. A job was available, and when I needed a job, I was coming out of I'd worked in the Southern Appalachians, and I wanted to return to the Northwest where the wind didn't blow, and I wasn't aware that Ellensburg had a little bit of wind. If I'd probably known that, I might not have initially come to Ellensburg. I'm sorry I said that, Nick, but
yes, it's okay.
True. I think your audience is aware that there is a wind.
They are in the know. They are for sure in the know. So in addition to your working with students and learning about the local geology, there was some connection to shell oil.
Well, we mapped the basalts for about, nearly 10 years. But then Shell was interested because of they thought this was a gas field. And so they began to hire Jack Powell and I, and we would spend, Jack would spend much of the spring, and then I would join him for the summer and fall, and we would produce one of the ridges each year, and we were able to do 4 or 5 of the ridges, and we looked at them in great detail.
Covered them on foot, mapped at what scale?
Mapped everything, mapped them at 1 inch equals 1,000 feet. So we knew some of the areas, and now I'm going back and looking at some of these old sections, and they're usually the way we said they were, but sometimes we discover new things. I just discovered some new things at Frenchman Springs Coulee the other day. We found some Poyho structures and some structures in the basalts that we didn't know existed. But then I thought about it a little bit, and we did see them before, we just didn't interpret them right.
Okay, all right. So how did Shell know about you and Jack, or did you approach Shell?
No, I think Shell probably approached me.
You had some things published by that point, maybe?
Oh yes, and we probably, I don't know, Shell started with their geophysical crew here, and they were drilling the well in the canyon at Rosa, and then I really started working with them when they were working on the Whiskey Dick, which is just east of town. And everyone in the Kittitas Valley thought they were rich. They were sure that there would be oil and gas, and they were worried about the environmental problems with, it was a boom town, and it was an exciting time, but we just leaped forward in our understanding of the ridges, and of course improved the stratigraphy. The structures became different than I had mapped them previously in the 70s, support of the Hanford work. So it was always, but I always came back to essentially the Olympic Wallowa structure was what we were looking at.
Well, I think it's worth noting that that here you are in your 70s, shall I say?
I'm 78. I'm
78.
nearly in my 80s.
And this is still, this stuff is still buzzing in your head.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I get excited and jump up and down. Fortunately, I'm working with some former students, with Jack Powell and Steve Jenswald and Andy Miner occasionally, and we get excited. But I'm always the director. I want you to know that.
We all know our place.
But they're well trained, so I can depend upon what they see.
Well, a lot of people watching this program know Jack Powell. He's a local Department of Natural Resources geologist. How far back do you guys go?
Well, 1970, I think. I think he took freshman geology. I showed up and he looked unusual. He couldn't read or write very well, and so I took him out in the field, and we've been together. 40 years ago.
Sure.
So we've been together for 40 years.
So what is it about Jack that was kind of special? You've had lots of students.
He is inquisitive. He looks at things thoroughly, and he sticks to them. These are the things that he did, and he's marvelous. He's still a marvelous resource for the people in Central Washington with the DNR and the forestry people.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think the general knowledge by now is out there about some basic relationships about bedrock layers and volcanic mud flows out by Thorpe, etc. But you're still happily working along. What are a couple of your current objectives or pet ideas involving the local geology?
I'm glad you asked this, Nick, because I may be telling a lot of things that aren't absolutely proven yet. As you know, science is always growing, but I'm beginning to think that much of the inner layers, we've always known that they were volcanic mud flows that came in the Ellensburg Formation, the top, above most of the basalts.
Okay.
But now we're looking at the sedimentary layers in between the basalts, and we're seeing that they are probably big mud flows generated by megastorms. I think that megastorms, when the CRBs were erupting in the east, there were megastorms that were creating large floods, large debris flows that came down from the west, and maybe even large debris flows that came from the north. Many of the layers, sedimentary layers between the basalts, have sand with muscovite in it, and this has to have been come from north of Wenatchee. So you can imagine a very flat surface with some mountains to the west that generated these sands, and they just came down and flooded over this area instantaneously, or at least in terms of probably a few weeks or certainly a few years maybe. We just measured at the vantage up at the top of Vanderbilt Gap. We found 14 of these, of what we interpret to be these big storms.
In the Vantage Sandstone.
In the Vantage Sandstone. So we're not positive of this yet, Nick, but this is what we're excited about.
Yes, I asked for your pet idea. So let me make sure I've got this straight. These interbeds between the Columbia River basalts, which for years you and others were calling lake bed deposits.
Or Columbia River or Yakima River deposits.
Are now much more dramatic in origin.
Very much more. A very flat surface. There was a flat surface for between about 14 million and about 12 million. A very flat surface in this area. And one of the, since you're asking about things, and we're about to run out of time, one of the exciting things that's changed is we've discovered that the Columbia River basalts didn't erupt over 3 or 4 or 5 million years, but maybe over the majority of them came out in about 420,000 years. So this is a much more...
much of the Grand Ronde material?
The Grand Ronde and the Wanapum came out very rapidly. Wanapum a little bit longer, but...
This is Steve Riddell's stuff?
No, well, it's a number of people, but Riddell is one of the authors. Self at this is really some excellent work that they're doing in redating the basalts. It's very difficult to date basalts.
So sticking local, we all know the Yakima River Canyon south of Ellensburg, and you've thought for 40 years now on the development of that canyon. And you just mentioned no canyon, flat area up till, did you just say 13, 12 million?
Or about 13, 14 million.
When are we going to start cutting that Yakima River Canyon?
Probably about 14 million. And it begins as just a meandering river on a very flat surface. And it remains that way for probably 1 million years. And then gradually there is a little bit of uplift of the ridges. And we had some uplift probably at 12 million. And the majority of it broke loose between 10 and 7 million. That's when the Kittitas Valley was brought down, and the canyon was really cut during that period.
And how do you explain to somebody how you figure that out?
I figured this out with stratigraphy.
Okay.
We put together the stratigraphy, and then we interpret each stratigraphic layer, and this is the picture that you come up with.
And Poyho Structures over in Frenchman Spring Coulee, I'm just still trying to process that one. Where were you in the coulee to see those structures?
Well, we're right there where you've been many times on your field trip, looking at the Rosa basalt.
Yeah.
Did you ever look at the top of the Frenchman Springs, just down along the road there? Beautiful Poyho structures. Huh. And I didn't look at them before either, Nick. I'm not picking on you. But now that I've seen those, and these were postulated by Self and a group of geologists that I won't go into the details, but now that I've seen those, I can remember seeing them elsewhere. Yeah. They're not common, but they do occur. But it's still a big mystery about how these big basalt flows that covered areas 300 miles, 400 miles nearly in length, maybe 200 miles in width, or certainly 50 miles in width, how these erupted in even a few tens of years. That's still a big mystery.
Bob, besides yourself, who's working on these problems these days?
Oh, I don't really know always.
I don't either.
Steve Riddell at Hanford has been active all over the years. Yeah. Terry Tolan has been, he's working particularly with the groundwater. There's more money for studying these in the groundwater than geologic mapping is what I think every geologist wants to do, but very few of us are privileged to do that.
Well, you put the time in, that's for sure. We've got just a few minutes left. Maybe you can give us a sense. We've had other retired geology professors from Central here. We've had Jim Hinthorn and we just had Don Ring. Curious on your thoughts about how the department has changed over the years. So when you arrived in the early 70s, what was the scene? It was you and Don?
It was Don Ring and myself, and there were several. Carl Newman was here. It was a good small department. And we were always close to students. We never had many students, but what students we had, many of them went on were very successful.
Oh, you bet, yes.
And once I started getting the students involved in the local geology, this was probably the key to a lot of their education, particularly in the 70s. But once Jim Hinthorn came, we had more support probably. We started the field course in the Blythe area, but the students were supposed to come back, and during spring break, I didn't get to finish that story entirely.
Yeah.
During spring break, they were supposed to map out in the Columbia River basalts, and they were always surprised at how much more they could see in the spring
neat.
than they could see, than they knew last fall.
Good. And then even through the 80s, actually I didn't think about that. You didn't start the Blythe course until
about 1980.
1980?
Yeah.
What did you do before then for a field course besides working a couple of weeks around town?
I ran a field course around here. I ran a field course between here and Vantage one year. We were up in the Squawk terrain one year. There's not much for the students to see up there, but we ran it. And down, I started them in the Yakima River Canyon, just right in our backyard.
Yep. Any parting words of wisdom you have for the geology lovers that are watching this program?
I do.
Yes, please.
I want you to start getting the locals out looking at these rocks, Nick. You need to put together field trips that are very simple. And the more times they look at the rocks, the more they will love them, the more they will understand them. They will see a marvelous history.
Is there a roadside geology of Kittitas Valley that's been written, Bob?
Well, there's some that have begun. Yes, the answer is yes, Nick, but it has never been published.
Not readily available.
Well, it is available. I'll
Yes.
give you a copy. I'll
Good.
be very happy. I don't want to promise it, but I would love to see much of this started. You've talked about doing some TV field trip things. I think this is a marvelous idea.
I'm glad to hear you say that, and the audience is clearly there. This is not a surprise to you that people gravitate to these concepts, and they know the land well, and
they're curious.
Yeah.
And they've got extra time.
Yeah.
I was once at Glasgow University in Scotland, and they had just exactly this, where they got the people involved, and people actually begin doing the local people begin doing research.
Oh, really?
And it's a marvelous thing of bringing the story out.
There is potential there. Dr. Bentley, thank you so much for coming on the program
Thank you, Nick.
tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you, dear viewer, for tuning in yet again to the television program taped here at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington, 98926, Central Rocks. Thanks. We'll look for you next time. Hey, well done.
Thank you, Nick.